All right, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Hannah Leone. I'm a reporter for the Chicago Tribune with a focus on public schools. Today we're going to hear from several experts on COVID-19 related traumatic stress screening and managing traumatic stress response behaviors in the classroom. It's been an incredibly stressful year, especially Chicago public school students and educators here. They had an 11-day strike in the fall, and now a pandemic that continues to take lives locally and has totally disrupted the school year. And now with the police killing of George Floyd, that has sparked nationwide protests and fueled tough conversations about race and police violence, some conversations that were already happening, at least in schools here. Many of the same students who have been struggling with remote learning because of inequities that existed prior to the pandemic have also been on the front lines of protests this week. Some of them have been exposed to tear gas and rubber bullets. They haven't seen their teachers in person for months, and they still don't know what school will look like in the fall. So in this city where a lot of students have already have traumatic stress experience because of violence in their neighborhoods or other factors, and really everywhere, we're gonna have more students than ever before starting a new school year in the fall. Having recently experienced trauma that may continue to affect them for some time. So going into the fall, how should schools be preparing to address this traumatic stress with their students? We're going to be hearing from Sandra Chafulias, a professor in the School of Education at the University of Connecticut, Marisha Humphreys, an associate professor in the College of Education at University of Illinois, Chicago, Tanisha Jointer, a behavioral health specialist in the Chicago Public Schools Office of Social Emotional Learning, and Shipra Parikh, an assistant instructional professor in the School of Service Administration at the University of Chicago. So I'm going to ask all of you to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your research and how it relates to traumatic stress in schools.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yes? Okay. Tanisha's smiling. We were practicing before. I'm Sandy Chafulias. As Hannah had introduced me, I'm a professor in the NEAG School of Education at UConn. Previously, I'm a school psychologist by training. I was a school psychologist and school administrator in both urban and rural settings in New York for a while before I decided to become a trainer, an academician, and a researcher. And all of my work is really focused in assessment spaces in social, emotional, and behavioral domains for students in schools. And really with that work, trying to think of and work with schools to strengthen their systems, their data systems, their way of thinking about and evaluating students, because there's, from my practice days a really long time ago, there were definitely critical needs, and there still are needs even 20 years later. So I'm going to jump right in, because since we only have 5 minutes, so first slide. Can somebody advance the slide? I was asked to focus my remarks specifically on school assessment, so I want to dive right into those considerations. With that first summary on that left side saying that there really is no single assessment solution, and efforts really need to work with their current data structures, because I believe that resources are best focused on using data to strengthen our support systems right now. And I want to explain a little bit about what that means, and then we'll get into it a little bit further on our next slide. We've heard a lot of conversations already this morning about the social and behavioral reactions that we're going to see as students come back into schools and we grapple with this double pandemic. But as we have those conversations, I think we need to make sure that we emphasize that the reactions are going to look very different across whole child domains. So that's academic, we've already talked about that a bit, social, emotional, behavioral, and physical. We haven't really talked a lot about physical reactions that we're going to see as well. And those things are all going to swirl together by developmental stage. They're going to look different in our kindergartners maybe versus our junior high and our secondary students. So we have to really be thinking about this from a whole child perspective, and on top of that, understand that everybody has their own reactions. Reactions are not one size fits all. They're not uniform. We will have our own reactions that are going to vary based on the level of exposure that we've had to the different traumas and our individual interpretation. So when we talk about trauma-informed assessment in schools, it's first a really good idea to look at the picture on the right to refresh what we mean by understanding reactions with a trauma-informed lens. As you can see in the picture, there's kind of this interplay between exposure and individual interpretation. But even exposure isn't as simple as it might seem, because we have influencing variables such as the predictability. Did we know it was coming? The duration. COVID's given us a dinger, right, with its duration. The intensity and the consequences. So for example, what we mean by direct consequences, such as a death of a loved one, and intensity and consequences, might be more severe in places with high incidences of COVID. In addition, you can't just say duration is one thing, because as we're seeing around the country, the disruption to our familiar routines and what's typical environment, such as school closures, is varying drastically throughout the country and even within regions within the country. So there isn't like this one size space for exposure. And then on the other side, when you look at the individual interpretation, it gets even more complex, because we need to look at history of trauma exposure. We need to look at the environmental factors that are involved. So what are the support systems? What are the connections and the connectedness that we have? And then what are our individual personal coping styles and personal factors that can kind of, again, swirl together. So if you put all those things together, you know, why would we think that a single assessment solution would be the right path for a school district? And given all of the things that we expect to see coming in the way that we need to respond to the diversity of reactions, I also wonder why we would want to divert resources away from strengthening our support services to try and implement all these new assessment structures. Many of the reactions that we're going to see are expected. They're likely to improve over time, but it's really the conditions within the school environment that are going to play a role in the intensity and duration of the trauma stress reactions that we see. So yes, assessment's important, but it's what we're going to do to ensure an emotionally and physically safe environment that's going to be important in mitigating the number of students and staff who experience those long-term reactions. So, you know, even though I'm talking about assessment, responding to COVID first requires that we use our existing frameworks, and I think Tanisha's going to talk a little bit maybe about that later, such as our multi-tiered systems, to think about strengthening our core supports. Our triangle that we think about is a typical public health model that 80% will be responsive is not going to look like that when we come back. So we need to bolster what that core efforts look like first, while we consider then what trauma-informed assessment could look like for your setting. So let's move to the next slide as we help to think about the different options in thinking about trauma-informed assessment. This slide got a little bit messy because we couldn't use animations, but in short, when we think about the options, I'm asking that you start to think about flipping the conversation away from which assessment should I use to instead saying, why should I use it? Because what I'm hearing a lot in our different districts is, well, what do I need to add? What do I need to do differently? But I really think that the question should really be framed as, if I add X assessment, how will it change my Y response? Does that make sense? So I kind of put together these 5 questions and considerations, and we can run through with the brief example that you see on the side to explain what I mean. In that first question, it asks, you know, what assessment data do we need to inform our response? And so, of course, the answer is it depends. It depends on what you're trying to do. And you see some examples here on the right-hand side of reasons or rationales of what we're trying to do with our data. And when you look at each of those 3 different things, you might be thinking about different kinds of data because they're different reasons. So before you jump into an assessment solution, you have to have defined the reason. Or in other words, how will the results of your data shape your response? Or even more importantly, what recommended practices would be different based on whether or not you have those data available? So first start with answering your question about why you're needing the data. Then we can jump into question 2, which asks, what do we have in place already? This question is all about inventorying what are you doing now? And that means defining what is the indicator, so what is it measure, How often is it collected, by whom, who reviews the data, how is it reviewed? And it means looking more broadly across all of those domains of functioning. So we can think about typical indicators like attendance, academic screeners, behavior screeners, discipline referrals, school climate, visits to the school nurse, and so on and so on. And so if we step back and create that inventory and we decide when we need data and why we need this data based on our answer to question 1, we can find gaps and then decide how best we're going to fill those gaps. Now we get to the third question, which says, okay, so maybe we've decided we do want to add some assessments that are trauma specific. And the answer to this question is really that there is no one single trauma assessment that we would recommend. Generally, when we think about trauma specific assessments, we group them into assessments that measure exposure and assessments that measure symptoms, or both. So going back to that previous slide. But if you're going to even be thinking about adding this kind of trauma specific assessment in any direction, the bigger question again goes back to that question 1 about is it really going to help inform your response? And probably even most importantly is what resources are going to be needed to put this in place with high fidelity that doesn't take away from other resources that may or may not be needed within my specific setting. The earlier panel talked a lot about budget cuts and resource allocation that's going to be coming. So again, I would emphasize for me, I want to put my work into the resources to build the support structures. All right, I digress. So last question, and then we can move on. The last question, and probably to me is the most important right along with number 1, is what do I need to do to prepare all staff for their roles in trauma-informed identification and response? So it's about roles and responsibilities, defining who's doing what and ensuring that everyone knows they do have a role, but not just assuming that they're going to be able to do that. We heard that in the morning session as well, that we need to identify the professional learning needs to put that trauma-informed system in place, a system that balances both identification and response. So surveillance of things that we see happening and not interpreting them in one way, but figuring out, do I understand what's happening here? Who can I go to for help in my building to help me understand and process what I should do? Because all staff need to have the knowledge and skills that enable them to be aware of their own reactions, their own values and beliefs about behavior and emotions, and how that's influencing the work that you're doing in identifying, interpreting, and supporting student needs. To me, that's really the most critical. So quick summary is start with your existing frameworks. Don't reinvent the wheel as we're going through to do this. Examine options to strengthen, to fill gaps in what you're seeing within your existing frameworks. Fill those gaps, decide if you need to do something else, and how you have the capacity to do it effectively. And remember that we're focusing more heavily on interpretations of data that avoid assumptions about trauma or avoid soliciting excessive details, moving beyond the scope of what we do as a general classroom teacher. And then most important, let's return to the opening point that planning efforts really need to be focused on the professional learning needs of every school staff member in identification and supports to deliver an emotionally and physically safe environment for all. That's it.
Hannah?
Thank you. I think that we have Marisha up next.
Yes, indeed. Marisha is up next.
Okay. Hi, I'm Marisha Humphreys, and as was indicated, I am at the University of Illinois at Chicago as an associate professor. I am also a licensed clinical psychologist. So my work in terms of my research focuses on children and actually early adolescents and early adulthood, social emotional competence and learning, specifically looking at ways in which classrooms, from early childhood classrooms all the way to collegiate classrooms, can support students' social emotional competence to facilitate their academic and social engagement, with a specific emphasis on issues as it relates to racial identity as a part of social emotional competence, which is often missing in the research. So that's a little bit about me, and I will jump into the topic for today. And my point is growing and learning during traumatic experiences. We've already heard this morning about trauma, just reminding again, so we're all at the same point, that trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event. More than 2/3 of children, SAMHSA did a study, and more than 2/3 of children by the age of 16 have been exposed to some form of trauma. Now, mind you, that happened prior to our current pandemics. If you could change the slide, please. And right now, if you could advance the slide, thank you. And right now, students are experiencing two pandemics. They're experiencing a racial pandemic and a health pandemic. The racial pandemic of police violence, and although police violence against Black and Brown people have been going on for hundreds of years, the current experience and context that we're having right now, pulling it to the forefront, children are exposed to that, in addition to the health pandemic of COVID-19, which really brought this conference initially together. But we have to consider both of these issues. And as I mentioned, as you know, 2/3 of kids have been exposed to some type of traumatic experience. That was prior to our current situation. So we have to assume that all of our students have been exposed to two pandemics, that they have been exposed to two traumatic experiences. Now, the important things to remember is, and Sandy mentioned this as well, is trauma is very individualized. What may be the same event may be very traumatic for one person and only a stressor, mild, moderate, or severe for someone else. So we have to really be careful, but really remember these are the things that are happening, that our kids have been out of school for almost 6 months by the time they go back. For instance, here, either 5 months or 6 months in August or September, and that they've experienced and heard about the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and before that, children by police, Tamir Rice, knowing that a young boy by the name of Zion witnessed his aunt being killed while she was watching him in her home. So all of those things are there. So given that it's individualized, it's really important that we remember that the return to school is going to be bumpy for everyone. That does not mean everybody is having a traumatic response. And I hear that so often, especially when we talk about kids who are Black, who are brown, who are low income. Every behavioral reaction is not because they're traumatized. So let's please step back from that a little bit and really engage. And we can use some of what Sandy was talking about in terms of assessment, really informed, research-informed assessment, but also being more critical. Don't get caught in the trap of using at-risk indicators to identify whether a child has been traumatized. Really look for those behavioral and emotional indicators. And if you could advance to the next slide, please. And we really want, okay, I think oh, there we go. Thank you. We really want educators to engage in some self-reflection. You know, teaching should be a self-reflective process all the time. It's not just about your instruction, but really ask yourself these questions. Why do I think this student has experienced trauma? What information and data do I have? What do I need to do to support my students? And how can I create a positive learning environment for all my students? Because it really is our responsibility. It is not about pointing fingers at children, at communities, and at families, but what are we going to do in the context of our classrooms and our schools to support our students? And we need to provide that space. And so, you know, my recommendations are really given the space to talk. Your kids are going to have, your students are going to have a lot of questions, all the way down from preschool, all the way up to our seniors in high school. Give them the space to talk about it. People are so scared to allow these types of conversations, especially if it deviates into issues related to race. But we need to have that space. We need to show that, because if we're scared to talk about it, they're going to realize it's something that shouldn't be talked about. And we're just going to reify all the issues we have now. So be honest, but reassuring. Yes, even with little kids, please do not shy away from those types of issues. Even with, as it relates to COVID-19, they may ask, are you going to get sick? right? And be honest. Don't lie and say, of course, I'm never going to get sick. You don't know that. You can say, well, I'm doing all the things I need to do to protect myself, and share what those are. And I'm going to try and stay as healthy as I can. Be honest. Provide opportunities for your students to express themselves, whether that's verbally, in writing, performing, drawing. Give them a space. We need you to be steady, empathic, calm, and supportive. Please don't utilize these behavioral outbursts as ways to engage in punitive discipline. And we already know that Black and Brown and low-income students are more likely to receive more punitive discipline. So we do not want to further put them in a risk space. Because remember, the concept of at risk, it has nothing to do with the child, that anything they can control. It's all about what's happening around them. So let's not contribute to that. And so some of the things you might see in the classroom is, yes, you may see kids who are emotionally sensitive, they may be inattentive, they may be emotionally explosive, little things may set them off, clingy, you really want to stay close to you, maybe even anxious, disengaged, even hoarding behaviors, because you don't know what their experience has been during this time, because these pandemics has also elicited economic stressors, and actually, some would call it economic pandemic. So make sure we create a space where we can acknowledge, label, and validate and plan. Acknowledge students' emotions, label them, give them the words they need so they can use their words as opposed to only just their behaviors. Validate what they're feeling. Kids can feel anything they want. Do not tell them, you shouldn't be happy, you shouldn't be sad, you don't really feel that way. They can feel whatever they want. It really is around creating a plan for them for how they express themselves and how they're gonna work with them, not tell them, work with them on how they can plan to help cope and feel better. And this may include daily emotional check-ins in addition to those discussions. And as mentioned earlier by one of the panelists in the opening session, we really need to think about social emotional learning as the foundation and not integrating into academics. That I would really say we integrate academics into social emotional learning because it does provide the foundation for students to be able to engage and learn. And so I'll just end again with that final point on the slide was, we need you all, we need us, all of us, to be steady, empathic, calm, and supportive. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tanisha Jointer. I am the Behavioral Health Specialist for Chicago Public Schools, and I am so honored to be here on this panel with these amazing women sharing, teaching, and learning. So as the Behavioral Health Specialist for Chicago Public Schools, I manage all of our behavior interventions across the district. I support our trauma efforts as well as our behavioral health teams, which is a system and structure to refer students to intervention. And I'm so grateful that the two panelists before me spoke about some really powerful things, such as screening and such as how we see students' behavior. And so for the conversation that I want to share with you guys today is really around how do we see behavior? Can we go to the next slide, please? So the first thing I want us to think about is what contributes to behavior? What contributes to how we show up in the world? And I'm not speaking just about students, I'm speaking about us as adults. What contributes to how we experience life, how we navigate the world, both at work, maybe even at home? And I want us to think about those things, right? I'm thinking of things about my family. I'm thinking about teachers. I'm thinking about my friends, social media, perhaps. There are things as culture, social norms, stereotypes, biases, prejudice, power, privilege. All of those things contribute to how we see, view, and navigate this world. That's behavior, okay? And the two things that I want to make sure that we remember is that behavior is learned. And I don't know how old you all are out there, but for those of us in our 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and above, we have had all those years to learn our behaviors. We've learned how to navigate the world. We've learned which Starbucks has the best. We've learned which way we want our kids to sit. We've learned they need to sit crisscross applesauce, and I don't know why, because nobody's equipped for that, for real, right? We've learned these things, and these things navigate how we see the world. But I also want you to think about this. Behavior is a form of communication. When our students are behaving in undesirable ways, what are they communicating to us? I'd be remiss if I did not bring up the two pandemics that we are navigating through. One is COVID-19. Throughout COVID-19, we have seen, we have highlighted the disparities in communities. We've highlighted health disparities. We've highlighted access. We've highlighted the way in which we navigate this world. I want you to think about the behaviors that have been impacted for students. Students may be experiencing some grief, some loss, some separation anxiety. But before, again, we get to the students, I want you to think about yourself as an adult. How are you showing up in COVID? How are you navigating COVID? How are you experiencing this moment? Switching gears again, back to our second pandemic, this movement, this racial movement that we're in. How are you as an adult experiencing this moment? What are you understanding about the people who are protesting? What are their behaviors communicating to you? How do your fears and powers and prejudice show up in this moment? What is it that you need in this moment? So I want us to think about all of those questions as we try to put together what will fall look like for students. I want us to be reminded that our students have been without instruction for, again, in Chicago, it may be 5 to 6 months. I want us to think about that students will come back to us and they may not be able to sit crisscross applesauce. I want you to go back to that initial question about what contributes to behavior. And I want you to think about those things as the root causes to behavior when students are showing up in your classroom. I want you to think about the homes that our students have been in for the last 6 months. I want you to think about the fact that we've been sheltered in place for quite some time. I want you to think about the fact that we have seen police brutality time after time after time again, and we are waiting for a moment that those things have now boiled up. And I want you to ask yourself, what do you need in this moment? But I want you to understand this, that what you need may be significantly different than what our children need. But the way that we get to that is by understanding. Creating a space to understand, why are my students responding the way that they are? Why are people looting in communities? Why is this happening? This isn't just about me in this moment. One of the things that I want us to remember that Ms. Humphreys brought up is in classrooms, we oftentimes get so stuck on power and the control and the routine and what behavior should look like. Our students need a space to just be. They need a space that they can learn what are desirable behaviors for them. They need a space where they can put a name to this behavior, that I'm not just sad, but I'm also angry, that I'm also frustrated. And just like we teach reading, writing, and math, we have to teach desirable behaviors. But again, we must remember that there are some root causes to behaviors, that there are social injustice, that there are food disparities, that there are a number of things that impact how we show up each and every day. Next, I want us to think about, how do we move forward? I want us as school districts to be thinking about what policies and procedures do we need to examine that directly impact students' behaviors. Again, as adults, as educators, our students are modeling our behaviors. How are we showing up for them? 4 things I want us to do as we get ready to go back to school. I want us to first, as adults, check ourselves. I want us to have some honest conversations in these summer months about who we are as individuals. What do we actually believe in our students? What are our expectations for students? I want us to have high expectations for all students, but I also want us to understand that we have to reach our students before we can teach our students. I want us to understand that in communities, there have been hurt people that are hurting people, and we all are hurting in this moment, at this time. I want us to acknowledge the impact of COVID-19. I want us to acknowledge the impact of this moment. I want us to acknowledge the this racial movement. I want us to call it what it is. I want us to acknowledge that, yes, students are hurting, that we as adults are hurting. And it's through that acknowledgement that I think we can get to a space where we will seek to understand each other. We will seek to understand that at the core of us, Black, white, brown, or other, we are all human. We are all mankind, and we all want the same thing. And lastly, I want us to act. I want us to change our policies. I want us to not only change our policies, but I want us to change our practices. I want us to change procedures that continue to oppress communities of color. I want us to make sure that we show up as the adults that our students deserve. I challenge us to think, America, what has your behavior communicated? School districts, what does your behaviors communicate to your students, to your family, to your staff? And personally, I want us to think before we stand in front of children, what are my behaviors, both by action or by silence, communicating? Thank you.
Back to the moderator, Hannah.
Thank you. I think we still need to hear from Shipra.
I think you need to unmute.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm sharing my screen here. First of all, thank you to everyone who just spoke. I think, you know, it's really nice to feel that all of us are speaking today to different parts of the same conversation. And I really do appreciate that, because one of the things that we learn about in trauma work is repetition. We cannot hear this enough. So I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name is Shipra Parikh, and I'm an assistant instructional professor at the School of Social Service Administration at University of Chicago. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker in community practice. And so what that looks like for me is I encounter trauma all the time. I'm working with children and families. My co-presenter today, unfortunately, was called away, and I think it's just very symbolic, you know, everything that we are dealing with right now in our city, in our country, in the world. And she has been called away, Jacqueline Herrera, to Enlace Chicago, because they are currently engaged, as we're having this conference, in unity efforts among Black and brown youth to help stem violence that's been going on. And again, it's pain and it's hurt. And so, so we respect her ability to go do that. And we will continue this conversation in her absence today. But the focus of my work has been trauma, in particular, two strategies that I'm going to talk about, anti-adultism and participatory engagement. And I'll explain what those mean, as well as ethno-racial development of children and families. I teach courses in some of these areas at the university, and I support staff as a consultant in the Little Village community of Chicago. And most importantly, I'm really feeling very inspired about this after the conversations we've been having. I practice this every day. I think in some ways parenting really brought out my own activism, and having two kids at home that I'm practicing these kinds of ideas with every day, it is difficult. And I just want to acknowledge for all of us who are in a position where we've had to become teachers to our own children, it is hard, and we just appreciate all of our teachers so much more. So, you know, when I look at these historical responses to trauma, it sort of helps us kind of stay organized, because as everyone has said, you know, we have these two pandemics, and long before COVID, we've already been dealing with the need for trauma responsive care in our schools and in our communities. And I think a lot of communities have already sort of been putting into practice in different ways, things that we're now talking about, you know, SEL, all kind of the focus on emotions. You know, so that I titled this kind of "What Matters is What Works." I'm a big believer in pragmatism, because I have seen this not just in my own home, but with communities. And so when we think about these responses to trauma that we've typically had historically, I'm going to categorize them three ways: denial, repression, and anxiety. And denial might be things like ignoring people who have survived trauma, ignoring their pain, ignoring their stories, not listening to them, shutting them down, emphasizing silence. Repression could look like, you know, a lot of what we're seeing right now, avoiding real exploration of underlying issues and just looking at symptoms of things. You know, kind of pushing away these real social tensions that really have to do with how we hold power. And then anxiety, again, is a word that I often find has been associated with sort of like a worried well. You know, it only happens for certain communities. Well, for a lot of communities of color in particular, we somaticize our anxiety. Our kids are showing up with behaviors. And, you know, they're not going to say, I'm anxious, but they're going to come to the classroom and throw a chair. And so I think we need to kind of reframe how we even label some of these things, that everyone experiences anxiety, every child. No one in my house is sleeping, to be frank. And I'm not the only one. You know, it comes out in these ways that we're not always verbalizing. So internalizing these ideals of strength, right? Like resilience, like we, you know, sometimes it's a way of actually driving, you know, down more of that anxiety, overemphasizing things like reliance, self-reliance, and resilience. Resilience is super important, but I'm going to introduce this idea with kind of thinking about the brain. Malleability is really what neuroscience kind of helps us think about. Is, of course, resilience exists in communities, but malleability is sort of how our brains work. We can shift and change. Rather than kind of water off of our backs, because kids do need that support. And so when we look at kind of how these three trauma responses in society have kind of existed, we can think about macro levels things. You know, marginal denial would be things like marginalizing people's identities, youth voices, invisibilizing populations and their needs, underfunding schools in low-income neighborhoods. We can look at repression, racial profiling, ICE raids, over-policing of communities, arresting kids in school, you know, just thinking about what we're repressing. We're not getting to that kid's needs when we arrest them. And we're actually creating more structural problems for that child and their family. And then, you know, I think a lot about adultism with that, which is really kind of this idea, it's like any other ism, but it's discrimination of youth just based on adults' age, you know, just these ideas that we think we know more, we think we know better. We may, there may be lots of ways in which we can be supportive to our youth, but, you know, it's like that idea of, you know, because I say so. If it's not grounded in something that's relational, if it's not grounded in something that feels regulating or feels respectful, kids always know when they're not being respected. And so respect is not something that we demand from them. It's something we have to earn from them. And then anxiety. You know, I think about neighborhoods that are constantly being surveilled, that lead to kind of this state of fear and anxiety, police brutality, neighborhood looting. All of these things just, you know, they're just kind of re-triggering these wounds in communities, ways that we already didn't feel seen and valued. You know, it creates a neighborhood feeling of survival, fight or flight, in our minds. And so, you know, just to echo what has been said, these macro ideas, we know they're out there. If this can help us kind of categorize what we're experiencing and what we're seeing, I then turn to kind of like what we do with that. You know, teachers' responsibilities have shifted so far beyond often like the traditional sense of teaching. It's more than just knowledge, you know, and conveying that knowledge, but it's really, teachers are finding themselves responsible for calming a lot of this pain. Managing traumatic stress and managing just the stress of development. You know, being a kid and just growing up is also, you know, not easy. And so teachers can become dysregulated. And I really appreciate, you know, kind of this conversation we're having this morning to really encourage all of you listening to think about, what is this doing for you? What are some of the ways that you might be engaging in denial, repression, anxiety, the way you have felt denied, repressed, or anxious in your own teaching, in your own lives? Because if your kids are feeling it, it's a parallel process. You're feeling it too. And so we're both in it together. We've got to sort of break that cycle. And so in terms of denial, you know, how do we help with that? Try to think about being more developmentally informed rather than behaviorally, you know, sort of oriented. I know that's a big ask. We need each other to do this. We need our colleagues. We need like-minded people who feel supportive. We need our administrations to kind of get on board with, it's not just about behavior modification to manage a classroom. And I know that's a big ask for teachers. It's about really thinking about, what does a 4-year-old need that looks different from a 7-year-old, that looks different from a 12-year-old? I can't talk through problems with a 4-year-old because that part of their brain is not as developed as, you know, perhaps a child in high school. And so I've got to have some sensory strategies. Repression, right? Engaging in increasingly harsh punishments. We've seen this. Preschoolers are more likely to be suspended, expelled these days than ever before. Preschoolers. And we know that when that happens, that teacher is not feeling regulated. We know the teacher doesn't feel good about that. That doesn't feel good to anybody. You know, and then withholding of empathy from kids too, right? Kind of just get back to class, just get back to the job. That's a form of repression that we're also feeling. And anxiety, you know, fearing our children, fearing our students, and actually even becoming triggered by them. So, you know, these three kind of patterns are embedded in our society, in us. We've internalized them. It's like breathing in air. We've all breathed it in. And so we have to sort of, you know, practice some awareness about that and just try to name what is happening. Is this denial? Am I repressing something? What am I feeling dysregulated about? You know? And so adultism is one big way I think about how that looks, you know, just kind of leveraging power of being an adult, you know, forcing behavior change, withholding empathy, rather than remembering we were all, you know, we're all former children. We've all been through it and we wouldn't go back to it. I don't think it's a hard enough thing to be a kid. And so then, you know, a quote I think about often is we repeat what we don't repair. We are going to see this over and over again. We already do. Every new school year brings new opportunities, and you're going to have a kid that reminds you of a kid you had last year. And you think, oh my gosh, this is going to be a tough kid to work with. That's that repetition. And that also tells us that we need to continue to work on how to repair that, right? If we are feeling anxious about it, it's a sign. Let's pay attention to that. And a strategy that I have, you know, kind of found and seen some success with, certainly in my courses and my classes with my students, but also in the Enlace Little Village community, is increasing participatory action and power. And what that means is dismantling hierarchical power where kids are sort of at the bottom and adults are sort of at the top. You know, a lot of times, like, what kinds of things are we teaching about? What are we talking about in the classroom? As much as you can, trying to engage kids in a participatory way to say, what matters to you? What things are you wanting to talk about? Can we inform our curriculum so that you see yourself in it? Because the more kids do, we're going to be able to more effectively attend to all of their needs, you know, right? Not just the learning needs and the things they want to know, but how are we feeling too dysregulated to continue? Okay, let's pause. What do we need to do? And developing some sensory. And when I say the word sensory, I mean any of those 5 senses. Touch, auditory cues, visual cues, taste, you know, relationships, and just kind of being together in that way, flicking lights on and off. It's a very simple thing, but the difference between that and yelling for a kid's attention, I've seen kindergarten and preschool teachers be remarkably effective in those ways, you know, and really focusing on those relationships. And then just go to my last slide here. You know, I like this house metaphor. There's lots and lots of trauma-informed stuff out there. You are probably swimming in it, and you might feel a little bit like you're drowning in it because there's so much, and yet it's so overwhelming, and it feels so hard to implement it in the moment in a classroom. And so I use this house metaphor all the time. Each side of the house is kind of like a hemisphere of the brain. And when we think about the brain, we always want to think, when we're engaging with kids effectively in a trauma-informed way, it means starting at the basement, which is the brainstem. A lot of times adults, if you look at this, they start at the top floor. We start by talking. We start by reasoning. Why are you crying? You know, why are you having a tantrum? What is going on? Why are you so upset? Why did you hit her? These are questions that a dysregulated kid's brain, it renders them incapable of answering in that moment. We can get them there, but that's going to come through kind of engaging the brainstem first. So we have to engage that sense of fight or flight that they're in. A touch, lowering your body, getting at their eye level, you know, just really kind of these sensory strategies that can kind of reduce that sense of fear, reduce that anxiety in the moment, can actually help kids regulate breathing, any of those kinds of things. And then kind of working our way up. You know, once we've established safety a little bit, even just in the moment, then thinking about feelings, then thinking about affect, and then finally, lastly, ending up with, let's talk about what just happened, right? But we can't start there. And so I know this is a very sort of simplified kind of version of neuroscience, but again, let's be pragmatic. Let's start where all of us are. You don't need a neuroscience degree. I don't have one, you know, to kind of understand this stuff. But I think in terms of supporting each other and supporting our teams, in schools in particular. And so, you know, what I would just say is, and there's more information in the handout that I have that you'll be able to read probably from all of us. But I would just say, you know, to really just echo what has been said, we've got to be regulated and we've got to really rethink power in the classroom in terms of being participatory, engaging our kids. And the last thing I just want to mention, you know, thinking about my work within LASE, a lot of times of course, resources are important and we can recognize and understand the significant discrepancies in funding depending on your zip code and what schools have access to. But a lot of the most amazing work to me comes from creativity. And I have seen schools and communities, Little Village is one, who the teachers are doing incredible things that aren't necessarily things that cost money, but things that really require a relationship. Posting pictures, doing drop-offs at their kids' homes with pieces of cake for their graduation. I mean, it is unbelievable. And to me, I think about the brain a lot, how regulated brains, you know, in us can allow us to access, like go up through the floors of this house and access our creativity, which is our greatest gift as teachers. You're already doing it. These communities that have been suffering these kinds of funding crises and this other pandemic for years has already had to figure out, how do we value relationships and really prioritize that so our kids know they're coming to school because someone here cares about them. So I would say, you know, of course we need more resource allocation in equitable ways, but I also just really want to acknowledge the teachers who have been thinking so creatively out of the box to stay connected to these kids in the last few months, which have been incredibly difficult. So thank you.
Back to the moderator, Hannah.
Well, thank you all for sharing your research. That's a lot to take in. We don't have a ton of time left now, but I'd like to ask you all about with so many students experiencing the two pandemics that have been described, the racial pandemic and the health pandemic, and knowing that students experience these things differently, what can educators be doing now remotely to identify those students who are experiencing trauma? And what can they do when the next school year starts in the fall and maybe they have new students they don't have a relationship with yet or have even never met before? And what type of collaboration should be happening among educators to make sure that no student gets overlooked in between now and then?
I'll go first, I guess. I think for ending with your last question around collaboration, I think the big thing, one of the things that I notice is that oftentimes educators are not working collaboratively with their school mental health team, whether that's the school counselor, school social worker, and there's many reasons. Some of those are systemic in terms of, do you have one? How many do you have? How often is that person there? But I think often those resources are used by educators after there's a problem reactively. And my suggestion is we start now. You know, I did some research around training, pre-service training, combining school social work and elementary education students before they even graduate, and how do you work collaboratively together? So over the summer, really connecting with your team and thinking now about how is it that we're going to go about supporting students in the classroom. And the school social workers and counselors can help you think about ways to structure your class, ways to structure how to have conversation, give you pointers. And I think that's one of the big things around collaborating, is we need to start beforehand. And in terms of assessment, I really think that, I mean, Sandy will talk about that, but I think we have to be careful in terms of making assumptions about how we think the kids are going to respond. And so having a very broad area, understanding development and what grade level are you teaching? What is the development of children at that age, quote unquote, typical development? And most of the typical development research is not on Black and brown kids or low income kids across racial boards. So also understand what you're reading may not actually match the students you're working with, but it gives you a broad base, and then going from there and having those conversations. But I'll stop because, yeah.
I can jump in as well. So when I think about what we need to do as we prepare, we need to prepare this situation with all students in mind. Let's recognize first that trauma does not have a zip code. There are not certain kids who have trauma. They're not the trauma kids or the tier 2 kids. There are students who receive tier 2 services. There are students who have experienced trauma. But we need to create environments that create a space for all kids to have a place of healing, for all kids to have a sense of belonging and connectedness. We should absolutely start with those summer planning for professional development for teachers. But again, we really should look at our policies and our practices. I know that the MTS model tells us that 80% of students need to respond. And in the brief that I provided you guys, I think one of the things that we will see is that 80% of our students may not respond to our original tier 1 strategies and support. So what I would encourage us to do is engage the community in developing what are our tier 1 practices. What is it that we as a community need? I would encourage you all, as you prepare yourself for the fall, that we go to our communities, we do some community walks. Let's walk through the communities, walk the streets that your students walk. How do you feel in that space? Put yourselves in their shoes. So before we get to, again, assessing and referring students, I want us to first just create a space of wholeness for students. And in order for us to do that, we first have to make sure that we're showing up well. Over your summer break, I encourage you all to take the time that you need to come to a space of healing and understanding for yourself. I encourage you to look at your district's employee benefits, and perhaps if you feel that you need some counseling, some therapy, any things of that nature for yourself, to take advantage of those things for yourself, because again, we have to make sure that we're ready before we stand in front of students. One of the things that I want to encourage us to do is also look at data. I don't want us to end this school year and already be plotting the kids that we know are going to need support. I want us to understand that, again, our students have been without direct instruction, without the structures that they're used to, without that feeling of connectedness for quite some time. And so when we approach them in the fall, we need to approach them with some new eyes, some fresh lens, a new leaf. We cannot blame you, harm you, or hold grudges to you or about you from last year, things that you may have done on the remote platform, right? That we are starting over and starting fresh. And so giving students that opportunity to do that. I want us to restore and repair and rebuild our communities as well as our classrooms, and as well as in our community. And I'm going to stop there because I want to make sure that everybody gets some time.
I would just summarize, I think that Marisha had started us off with a couple comments about the role for school leaders in needing to lead how this work is happening. And the emphasis, Hannah, your question was about students, but I think Shipra and Tanisha really emphasized the fact that what really needs to happen now is on the adults, in the adult space, because if we are not ready to be emotionally and physically supportive, then it's going to get, it will be worse than what we would expect. So the planning and the efforts need to be there, and we need to acknowledge and understand that we're going to falter as we move along. And so understanding, just like how we're identifying and responding to students, we have to envelope everyone in the building into that and include staff as well. So that if I see, Tanisha, you know, you're having a really hard day, let me help you, or I'm having a hard day, can somebody help me as well, so that I can be, so that we can provide the most supportive environment for our students as they come back in the door, because that is going to be the most critical piece to whether, how successful we are as we re-enter.
And I think all I would add is, you know, just rethinking resources, just from a sort of a kind of a strengths perspective. Like, funding is one resource, but allocating, you know, what you just gave that example of staff support for each other. I don't know that I don't have the data, but I don't know that in more resourced school environments, if they're doing that better. I don't actually know if that's true. I have seen really wonderful examples of that in communities that feel they have to do that because that is how they operate normally. That just feels like a value in the community, and that represents how families operate. So I think just rethinking when we think about resources, what does that mean? We are all each other's resources. Parents are resources. And kids also have wonderful ideas about how they want to be treated. They're a huge resource.
Thank you. We've been talking a lot about how to address the trauma that's occurring now when the school year starts, but how can the return to classroom instruction itself affect students emotionally, and how do we prevent further trauma from occurring at school and establish a specifically anti-racist classroom and school building?
Well, I think no, go ahead, Cindy.
I was just going to start very quickly just to give a really quick shout out to the Chicago Public Schools for the materials that you have available on anti-racism curriculum and things that you can use as an everyday teacher and person yourself, because I know we're here in Connecticut, but we've distributed that link out to our communities. So thank you.
Well, I think those materials are very helpful in sharing those out. But I also think one way that we, in terms of your point, Hannah, about re-traumatizing, if we engage in punitive discipline, we are re-traumatizing our students and their families. And so when you have an emotional or behavioral outburst in class or in school, again, it's the educator's responsibility to, hopefully we've done the work and we have our emotional competence abilities intact, that we can respond calmly and first check and ask ourselves, why is this child responding that way? Of course, our first responsibility is to make sure that child and the other children or teens are safe, but then trying to figure out what's happening. And so, you know, many of us noted that kids are going to behave often behaviorally to these experiences, these traumatic stressors. And it can be throwing a chair because they're anxious or sad or afraid. And it can be, you know, just a pool of tears. It can be not staying focused, right? Being very inattentive. So we don't want to respond with kicking kids out of classroom, suspending them. That is not how we support kids. It really is. Then we have to figure out, what do we need to do to get them the support they need? So I think the biggest thing is we can't be so quick to engage in punitive discipline for these types of behaviors. Otherwise, we're going to re-traumatize. And I think the other piece is around, yes, we can use materials that are out there, and we should. We need to educate ourselves as educators about the issues and how to talk to students. But I've seen, even actually just this morning, of a teacher at a really great school demonizing how students were feeling about what was going on with the racism pandemic, and told them they were overreacting. That is re-traumatizing, okay? And how can you learn from someone who isn't even acknowledging how you're feeling? You don't have to agree, but you have to respect and acknowledge and support. And so I think those are really, really important.
As I think about your question, I think a few things. I think one, really focusing on building the relationships with students and families. I think in building relationships, again, it goes back to us creating that understanding how this student may have experienced the trauma, what is traumatic for that student. So we just have that understanding. I think too, also knowing when you're not the person. I was a school social worker for 8 years, and I just knew that I was like everybody's person. Everybody loves me. I'm the social worker, for God's sakes, right? But you may not be the person, even if you're the classroom teacher. But then what I would encourage you to do is collaborate with others, because one of the most underutilized, under-resourced people, I think, in schools are oftentimes our school clerks. It is our lunch ladies. It is perhaps the janitor. Those people have relationships with students because they just have different relationships with them. They expect little, but give them so much in the building. And so I want to encourage us all to consider leveraging those professionals in how we support and work with students. Ways in which that I think the trauma can show up. We will definitely see students being hyper aroused. I know it is a teacher best practice to have proximity, but in the wake of in a post-COVID world, we will have to rethink proximity and what does that mean and what does that look like, right? Because we will have students who are anxious and do not want you in their personal space. I think negative cognition, negative thinking is something that we also have to prepare ourselves for. As I kind of think about this, both pandemics and more specifically this racial movement that we're in, I feel like our young people have everything to fear and nothing to lose. Say that back. They have everything to fear. COVID has shown them they have everything in this world to fear and absolutely nothing to lose. And so I encourage you to sit in that thought and think about, what is it that you need? in a space like that, in a world like that?
Maybe one hopeful part about this pandemic goes back to something that Tanisha had brought up earlier around using the data that you have already and thinking about it in different ways. And back to Marisha's point too, about maybe this is finally the time and the where we can capture the ability to look at data and disproportionality and exclusionary disciplinary practices and move it to action. So maybe we can take this opportunity and move that needle farther than we have been. I'm hopeful about that. Can we do that together?
What I would add to what's already been said is, actively and openly identifying white supremacy in spaces. Because, even our educational system, the way it looks in a mainstream kind of way, all of the qualities, and there's really great resources out there, many of which are free online, but most of the qualities of white supremacy culture are actually inherently traumatizing. And you can see that. It creates a quantitative behavioral environment for kids to learn in, and it completely sort of underscores all this relational work that we're saying is important and that we are seeing as being important. And so I think just like as educators naming that, and one really concrete way is, does your curriculum reflect your kids? Does your curriculum reflect the history of the community of the school that you're teaching in? At University of Chicago, I have to think about this all the time. I'm in a school of social work at the University of Chicago on land that was Native American land. And we have to think of it just as a basic starting point. I just think about that every day in a class, so just starting by invoking that, naming that with our students. These are graduate students, and there are ways to do it, to scale it down developmentally for younger kids, but younger kids get perfectionism. They get that. They get like, you're right or wrong. They get that feels hard. And that's something we can, I think just overtly as educators, really just naming that.
Along these same lines, is there a way for police to exist in schools today without adding to students' trauma?
My question is, how would they do that? Schools are a place of education, not militarization. It's not a prison. It's a place of learning. And so there is a body of research that shows when police are present in schools, negative student outcomes. So how can we support that? If we really are talking about research-informed practice, it's telling us, it's shouting at us that they are not supposed to be present in schools. We have to really think long and hard about why we are using them in schools. What is our point in having them in schools? And we may uncover some very strong biases about the students we're serving, because where police are located and which schools they're located, it looks very different. And even here, I think about here in Chicago, they had a vote on whether they should continue to include police in our schools, and only one board member voted against it, and she invoked the research.
How do we have these discussions in a classroom? And how do you encourage children to talk about their trauma in a healthy way without pressuring them to share things they're not ready for?
So I think when we think about how do we have conversations in classrooms, I think, again, it is about us showing up authentically as we are as the adults, right? We have to create space for that. We have to remove the punitive measures that may come as conversations come up. We have to be able to sit in the discomfort of how your students navigate and experience this world, which sometimes is really hard for adults to do. I think that, one, I do not encourage people to have, deep conversations about traumas that students have experienced in a group setting. I do not encourage people to have these conversations and not have a space for healing to continue, because we can rip or peel a Band-Aid off and we can, oh my God, we can create a whirlwind of trauma for students. So we never want to, you know, make this space where students feel like they have to say that I've experienced something traumatic. I think instead we should and we could daily create a space of care. We can have restorative conversations. We can start our day with morning meetings. I love to encourage people to have a meeting afternoon after lunch, because our kids come back to us after lunch as totally different people. They look different, they smell different, everything about them is different after lunch. Have some conversations with them about what happened. Have conversations with them at lunch. One of the things that we know is that food connects us as human beings. And so sitting with your students and having conversations about how they see and how they navigate the world is crucial. And also, let's not forget to have those conversations as colleagues. We can do lunch and learns all day where we are reflecting on how we show up for students, where we are perhaps engaging in some book studies about the traumas that our students have, again, told us that they're experiencing, and about just the traumas that we are all collectively experiencing right now in this moment. So I would encourage us to engage students, create safe space, but also know when it's time to consult other people like your clinicians, your social workers, or psychologists.
Thank you. I think this panel is supposed to end at noon, and it's noon now. So is there any final thoughts that any of you wanted to leave us with?
We can do this if we do this together. That's what I think. I'm trying to work on our own regulation and our own anxiety and our own issues, and we can do this, and we can do it successfully.
I want to encourage us to create spaces that our children's children will be proud of.
I would say ask your kids, ask your students, ask their families. People know how they want to be treated, and being a community school, being in a community means really being a representative of what people's needs are.
I would say make sure you're engaging in self-reflection and working on your own social emotional skills so that you can be there for the students, and making sure that you are supporting student and community voice.